I remember the morning I set out on that hike with a clarity that still feels sharp even years later. The sun had barely begun to rise, and a thin fog hovered over the forest floor, clinging to the low shrubs and damp ground. I had chosen a trail I had never been on before, one that promised isolation and solitude. The map indicated that it was a loop trail through a mountainous section of the national park, with a few small streams and rocky outcrops along the way. I had been hiking for years, and while I never considered myself reckless, I had grown confident in my ability to handle rough terrain and unexpected weather. I had packed enough water, snacks, a first aid kit, a map, and a compass, but I hadn't anticipated the way the environment itself would test me. The first mile or so was pleasant. The trail was narrow but clear, winding around clusters of pine trees that rose tall and straight into the sky. The air was crisp and smelled faintly of wet earth and pine needles. Birds flitted from branch to branch, and in the distance, I could hear the occasional rustle of small animals moving through the underbrush. I moved at a steady pace, my boots sinking slightly into the soft, damp soil. I paused occasionally to take photos of the landscape, the sunlight breaking through the fog in golden shafts that made the mist sparkle. I felt calm, almost euphoric, enjoying the silence and solitude. As the morning turned into midday, the trail began to incline more steeply. Rocks replaced soil as the path grew rougher, and I had to use my hands at times to steady myself on particularly steep sections. The exertion made me sweat, and I drank water frequently. I noticed a small creek running alongside part of the trail and stopped to refill my water bottle. The creek was clear and fast-moving, tumbling over rocks and creating tiny waterfalls. I watched as the water sparkled in the sun, thinking how peaceful it all was. At that point, I was completely alone. I hadn't seen another hiker for hours, and the trail markers were sparse, small wooden posts that sometimes appeared only after several minutes of walking. I had the sense that I was going deeper into territory fewer people ventured into. By late afternoon, the trail became even steeper and rockier. I had been following a ridge for some time, the terrain dropping off sharply on one side. The wind picked up, and I could see clouds forming over the mountains in the distance. It wasn't a storm I could see immediately, but the sky was turning a darker gray, and the air grew cooler. I paused on a large boulder to catch my breath and take in the view. Below, the forest stretched endlessly, a patchwork of green and brown, with streams cutting through valleys that I could barely make out. I felt a pang of unease, though I couldn't pinpoint why. There was something in the way the shadows of the clouds moved over the hills, something that made the place feel suddenly larger and emptier than before. I continued along the trail, thinking I would soon reach a small plateau I had marked on my map where I could rest and eat. The trail became less distinct, scattered with loose rocks and fallen branches. At one point, I realized I had missed a turn. The path I had been following seemed to lead downhill, but my map indicated the trail should curve around the ridge. I paused, crouched down, and studied the map carefully. I realized I had taken a wrong fork, probably a small offshoot used by wildlife or local hikers. My heart rate sped up slightly, not from exertion but from the realization that I was now off trail and alone in an area I barely knew. The fog had thickened in patches, and visibility dropped to a few meters at times. I tried to retrace my steps, but the terrain had shifted. Loose stones made it easy to slide, and fallen logs blocked my way. As I tried to find the trail again, I noticed something unsettling. The forest grew quieter. The normal rustling of animals, the occasional birdsong, all had vanished. The only sound was the crunch of my boots on the dry leaves and twigs. I told myself it was normal, that wildlife probably sensed me and had moved deeper into the forest. But then I saw the first sign that something was truly off. A tree trunk lying across the path ahead of me had deep, jagged scratches etched into its bark. I stopped and examined them. They weren't from a bear or any animal I knew. Too deep, too wide, almost like someone had tried to chop or gouge the tree. I felt a cold weight settle in my chest. I reminded myself that people sometimes mark trees for reasons I didn't understand, but the location of this tree, in the middle of a rough, seldom used path, made me uneasy. I pressed on, careful to stay alert. The fog thickened further, now swirling around the trees and obscuring distant shapes. I could barely see more than 10 or 15 feet ahead. The path was getting harder to follow. Rocks jutted out at odd angles, some slippery with moss, and the incline was exhausting. I had to stop several times to catch my breath, leaning heavily on my trekking poles. My legs ached, and my fingers were stiff from gripping the poles for hours. I knew I needed to keep moving, though, because the sun was beginning its slow descent toward the horizon. If I didn't find my way soon, I would be stuck in the forest after dark, and that thought made my stomach tighten. After what felt like an eternity of careful navigation, I saw a faint opening ahead. I hurried toward it, hoping it was the main trail or some clearing that would give me orientation. As I reached the opening, I realized it was not a clearing but a sheer drop. A cliff stretched down dozens of meters, the bottom lost in fog. My stomach dropped. I had no choice but to backtrack. I turned and looked for the path, but in my absence, the fog had shifted. The trail markers I had relied on were gone from sight, hidden behind mist and shadows. Panic began to creep in. I tried to calm myself, breathing deeply, but the cold sweat on my back and neck betrayed my anxiety. I realized that I could easily become disoriented and get lost completely if I didn't focus. I tried to recall landmarks, the position of the sun, the slope of the ridge, anything that could guide me back. But everything seemed wrong, unfamiliar, and overwhelming. I decided to mark my path, placing small piles of rocks where I stepped, so I could trace my route backward if necessary. Every step was careful, deliberate, testing the stability of rocks and branches before putting full weight on them. At one point, my boots slipped on a wet rock near the edge of the ridge. I caught myself just in time, my heart leaping into my throat. My hands were scraped from gripping the rocks, and my palms stung. I realized that if I fell here, there would be no one to help me. The thought froze me in place for a moment, but I forced myself to keep moving. I couldn't let fear immobilize me. Hours seemed to pass. The sun dipped lower, the fog turning to a pale gray that dimmed the light even further. I was cold, exhausted, and hungry. My water supply was low, and I was starting to feel the early signs of dehydration. Dry lips, a scratchy throat, and slight dizziness. At one point, I stumbled into a small creek, its water shallow and icy. I knelt and drank carefully, hoping to replenish some fluids. The water was cold and tasted of minerals, but it revived me slightly. I rested for a moment, splashing water on my face and hands to wake myself. I tried to focus, thinking through the map in my head, retracing my steps as carefully as possible. Every branch, every rock, every tree I passed I tried to memorize. Eventually, as twilight approached, I began to recognize faint features of the ridge I had crossed earlier. There was a particular formation of rocks, a cluster of pine trees that leaned at an angle, a small waterfall visible in the distance. These markers gave me a glimmer of hope. I pushed onward, moving slowly and carefully, almost crawling in some sections where the terrain was treacherous. The forest was silent now, save for the distant rush of water from the streams below. My mind kept running scenarios, calculating the safest routes and avoiding the steepest sections. Each decision felt critical, every misstep potentially dangerous. As darkness fell, I realized I needed to stop somewhere safe. I found a small flat area near the ridge, sheltered partially by a large fallen tree. I used my backpack as a pillow, laid down on a bed of pine needles, and tried to rest. My body ached, and my muscles trembled from exhaustion. I stayed alert, listening for any sounds that might indicate danger, though the only noise was the wind whispering through the trees. I covered myself with my jacket, shivering, and tried to focus on conserving energy for what I hoped would be the final push back to the main trail in the morning. Morning arrived slowly. The first light of dawn revealed the forest in a softer hue. I stood, stretching my stiff limbs, and assessed the terrain. Using the landmarks I had memorized the day before, I began moving cautiously toward what I hoped was the main trail. Hours passed, my pace slow but steady. I avoided loose rocks and unstable slopes, careful not to take unnecessary risks. Eventually, the fog lifted slightly, and I saw something that made my heart pound. I had been planning this hiking trip for months, mapping every mile in my head, imagining the route, the streams I would cross, the ridge I would climb, the small valley where I imagined stopping to rest and eat. It was supposed to be a simple solo hike, something to clear my mind and push myself physically. I liked the idea of solitude, the kind of silence that comes when you are far away from roads, cars, and people. I had packed carefully. Backpack with plenty of water, a stove, dried food, first aid kit, compass, map, headlamp, extra batteries, rope, and a sturdy knife. I even packed some emergency flares, not expecting I would use them, but the thought of having them made me feel slightly more secure. I started my hike in the morning, with the sun just beginning to rise over the mountain ridges. The air was crisp, sharp with the cold of the high altitude. I followed a trail that wound through the forest, a mixture of pine and deciduous trees, their leaves turning shades of orange, yellow, and red. The forest smelled of damp earth, pine resin, and leaves beginning to decay. At first, the trail was wide, easy to follow, and my steps crunched softly against the fallen leaves. Birds called in the trees above me, and I saw a few squirrels darting through the underbrush. I felt at peace, confident in my planning, careful not to rush, taking time to enjoy the small details. The way sunlight filtered through the trees, the smell of damp moss, the sound of a distant stream. After a few hours, the trail narrowed, becoming less obvious. Rocks jutted out from the ground, tree roots tangled across the path, and the underbrush grew thicker. I had to be careful with each step, watching where I placed my feet to avoid twisting an ankle. My backpack, though not heavy, felt cumbersome as I moved uphill. Sweat began to bead on my forehead even though the air was cool. I stopped for a break beside a cluster of boulders and pulled out my water bottle. I drank slowly, savoring the cold, clear water. Around me, the forest seemed quieter, as if it were holding its breath. I shook the feeling off, thinking it was just the natural isolation of the trail. By mid-afternoon, the trail became almost unrecognizable. Fallen trees blocked the path, and I had to climb over some, duck under others. I consulted my map and compass frequently, making sure I stayed on the correct route. The forest was thick now, the trees so close together that sunlight barely reached the ground. Shadows stretched long and deep. I realized that the trail I thought was easy to follow was now little more than a faint suggestion on the earth. Small rocks, tree roots, and patches of loose soil made footing treacherous. My legs ached, my muscles burning from the steep incline and uneven terrain, but I pressed on, telling myself that the end of the trail was not far. It was when I crossed a small creek that things started to feel wrong. The water was cold and fast-moving, and the stones beneath my boots were slick. I slipped slightly, catching myself with my hands, the sharp edges of rocks scraping my palms. My heart raced from the scare, and I paused to regain my balance. That's when I noticed something unusual. The forest around me was quiet in a way it hadn't been before. There was no rustle of leaves, no birdsong, nothing but the sound of the creek. I looked around, and it felt as though the world had shrunk, the trees pressing closer together, the light dimming rapidly as clouds moved across the sky. I decided to keep moving, feeling a twinge of unease but convincing myself it was just my imagination. I climbed a steep embankment on the other side of the creek, using the roots and rocks to pull myself up. My hands were dirty and scratched from the effort, my legs trembling from fatigue. When I reached the top, I realized that I had lost the trail completely. The path I had been following was nowhere to be seen. I checked my compass and map carefully. According to them, I was still within the area I intended to hike, but the terrain around me had changed. The forest was denser, the ground uneven and steep, and the natural features I had memorized seemed to shift with every step. Panic began to creep in. I knew from experience that losing a trail in the wilderness was dangerous, but I also knew that panic made mistakes more likely. I took a deep breath, sat on a fallen log, and tried to calm myself. I drank water, ate a small piece of energy bar, and considered my options. My first thought was to try and retrace my steps to the creek. That seemed reasonable, so I started moving slowly, carefully watching my footing. The forest was almost silent, the only sound the crunch of leaves under my boots and my own breathing. As I moved, I noticed the shadows lengthening rapidly. The sun was already low in the sky, and it became clear that if I didn't find the trail soon, I would be forced to continue in the dark. I increased my pace, scanning for any sign of the path, any markers, anything that would indicate direction. The forest floor was uneven, full of hidden holes and loose rocks. My legs were aching from hours of steep climbing, and my hands were scraped and bleeding slightly from grasping branches and rocks for balance. The feeling of being completely alone began to weigh heavily on me. I realized how quickly a situation that had seemed like a pleasant hike could turn dangerous. By late afternoon, I was truly lost. The sun was dipping behind the ridges, and shadows deepened into darkness. I had tried to follow the map, but the landscape seemed to twist in ways the map didn't reflect. I was at a high elevation now, and the terrain became more treacherous. Loose rocks slid under my boots, and the slopes were steep. I realized that continuing in the dark would be incredibly risky. I needed to find a safe place to wait until morning. I spotted a flat area among some dense trees that seemed relatively sheltered from wind and loose rocks. I cleared a small space, laid down my backpack, and began preparing for a night in the wilderness. I gathered branches and dry leaves to create a makeshift bed, careful to avoid anything that might conceal snakes or insects. I ate the remainder of my food, drank water, and tried to make myself comfortable. The forest around me felt enormous, oppressive, and silent. The temperature dropped quickly as the sun disappeared completely. My hands and feet were cold, my body tense from the day's exertion and the anxiety of being lost. I wrapped myself in my jacket and settled down, constantly listening for any sounds that might indicate danger. Loose branches snapping, animals moving, the wind shifting through the trees. Night passed slowly. I woke several times, disoriented, thinking I heard something moving in the dark. Every shadow seemed threatening, every sound amplified. I reminded myself that bears were unlikely at this elevation and that most wildlife would avoid me. Still, the primal fear of the wilderness in complete darkness kept my heart racing. When the first faint light of dawn appeared, I felt a surge of relief. Visibility returned, and I could assess my situation more clearly. I used the compass and map to orient myself, and slowly began moving in a direction that should lead back toward the main trail. The terrain was still difficult. Steep slopes, thick underbrush, and loose rocks. I moved cautiously, stopping frequently to rest, drink water, and make sure I wasn't slipping or losing my bearings. Hours passed, and the forest gradually began to thin. Sunlight reached the forest floor again, warming my chilled body. I spotted distant ridges that looked familiar from my map. I felt a glimmer of hope. By late morning, I found the trail. It was overgrown and faint, but unmistakable. I couldn't remember ever being more relieved to see a trail marker. My legs ached terribly, my hands were scratched and bleeding, and my face was dirty and sunburned in patches. I rested briefly, drank water, and gathered myself before continuing. The trail led me downhill through a more navigable forest, and I began to pick up speed. My body was exhausted, but the knowledge that I was no longer lost gave me renewed energy. I reached the parking area by early afternoon. My car was exactly where I had left it. I sank into the driver's seat, taking several deep breaths, feeling every muscle in my body relax in relief. I felt exhausted, bruised, scratched, and very aware of how close I had come to a serious accident. But I also felt an immense sense of accomplishment and gratitude for having navigated the wilderness safely. I had planned carefully, stayed calm under pressure, and relied on basic survival skills. Navigation, water management, rest, and careful observation of my surroundings. The drive home was long but peaceful. I kept thinking about the forest, the silence, and the danger I had faced simply by losing the trail. It was a humbling experience, one that reminded me how small I was compared to the natural world and how fragile safety could be. But it also reminded me that with preparation, careful observation, and calm decision-making, even a dangerous situation could be navigated safely. I returned home with my I had planned this hike for months. The trail I chose wasn't particularly well known, at least not to tourists or casual hikers, and I wanted the solitude, the chance to push myself physically while also being surrounded by nature that felt raw and untouched. The area was a remote mountain range, with old forested slopes, jagged rocks, and streams that twisted unpredictably through valleys. I had checked maps, weather reports, and brought enough gear to last several days in case something went wrong. I packed extra water, dried food, a first aid kit, my sleeping bag, a small tent, matches, a compass, and a GPS device. I knew the risk of relying solely on electronics in such a remote area, but I had to balance weight with safety. The first day of the hike went well. The weather was crisp but manageable, with a clear sky and a soft sun filtering through the trees. The trailhead started at the base of a narrow valley. The path was uneven but marked by small wooden posts, weathered by years of wind and rain. Early in the day, the forest was alive with birds and small rustlings in the underbrush. I kept my pace steady, stopping every hour or so to drink water, check my map, and photograph interesting moss-covered rocks or twisted tree roots. By mid-afternoon, I had climbed enough elevation to see the valley stretching below me. The air was thinner up here, colder, and carried the scent of damp pine and earth. As I continued, the trail became more rugged. Rocks jutted out from the ground, and the forest grew denser, the canopy forming a thick ceiling overhead. I had to be careful with each step to avoid slipping on moss or tangled roots. I noticed the occasional broken branch, and the deeper I went, the quieter it became, until even the birds seemed to vanish. The quiet was different from peaceful. It had weight, pressed in on me in a way I wasn't used to. I brushed it off as normal for deep forest, but I could feel my senses sharpening. Every crackle of a twig, every sudden movement of a branch, made me pause and glance around. By late afternoon, I reached a narrow ridge. The path here was almost a knife's edge, with steep drops on both sides, rocks slick from recent rain. I clipped my trekking poles in tighter, testing each foothold before stepping. The view was spectacular but also intimidating. One misstep here, and the consequences would be fatal. I slowed my pace, careful, deliberate. I realized that even though I had hiked rugged terrain before, nothing had prepared me for this level of exposure. The ridge stretched for about half a mile before dropping into another small valley. As I descended, I noticed signs that something had passed this way recently. Not humans, but animals. Fresh tracks in the soft earth. Larger tracks than any deer, wider paw prints, the drag marks of claws. My stomach tightened. I had read about the occasional bear wandering this range, and although encounters were rare, I knew I had to remain vigilant. I tightened the straps on my backpack and ensured the bear spray holstered on my side was accessible. By evening, I decided to set up camp near a small clearing along the valley floor. The sun was dipping below the peaks, leaving a dim light that filtered through the trees in a golden haze. I found a flat area, cleared rocks, and set my tent. I gathered firewood, dry enough to ignite with matches, and built a small fire to ward off animals. Cooking my simple dinner of dehydrated vegetables and a protein bar, I kept my eyes and ears alert. The forest at night was alive with subtle sounds, rustling leaves, distant waterfalls, and the occasional snap of a branch. I reminded myself that most of these were probably harmless, the work of small animals, but the uncertainty made the night tense. Sleep was uneasy. I lay in my tent, listening to the wind whistle through the trees and the sounds of creatures moving nearby. I double-checked the tent zippers and my knife, knowing that if a large animal approached, I would have very little time to react. I dozed in bursts, waking at every unusual sound, heart racing. Morning came gray and cold. I packed camp quickly, drank water, and continued along the trail. The plan was to reach a higher ridge where the path forked into a loop that would eventually bring me back down toward the trailhead. As I climbed, the forest thinned, replaced by rocky outcrops and sparse vegetation. The trail became less obvious. There were no posts, no markings, only faint indentations in the soil that might have been footprints or might have been erosion. I stopped several times to confirm my position on the GPS and map. That was when I realized the trail might be misleading. I had thought the loop would take 2 days, but the GPS indicated I might be off course. The thought made my stomach tighten again. I tried to retrace steps, identifying landmarks I had passed, but the forest and rock formations were deceptively similar. Every rock outcrop looked like the last. Every cluster of pine trees could have been the one I had seen earlier. By midday, the sun was high, but the clouds had thickened, muting the light and dropping the temperature. I pressed on, hoping to find a recognizable marker. Hours passed. My pace slowed, and I realized I had been walking in a general direction, but not along any clear path. The forest and rocks had swallowed the trail completely. Panic began to seep in, though I tried to suppress it. I had survival training, knew how to stay calm, how to ration water, how to navigate by the sun if necessary. But fear is a persistent companion when you feel small against a vast wilderness. I stopped near a small stream to drink water and rest. The cold water was refreshing, but it reminded me that the day was moving quickly and the forest would grow dark again soon. I considered my options. Going forward blindly might lead me deeper into uncharted terrain. Backtracking was possible but risky. Without clear markers, I could circle back to the same spot unknowingly. I sat for a long time thinking, studying the map, trying to identify terrain features that matched what I could see. As the afternoon wore on, clouds rolled in heavier, and a fine drizzle began. Rocks and roots became slick, making footing treacherous. I moved carefully, using my trekking poles to maintain balance, but each step required full concentration. The forest grew darker under the clouds, and the wind picked up, carrying with it the sharp scent of rain and wet earth. My fingers were stiff from cold, my boots muddy, and my energy dropping. I ate a protein bar and drank water, trying to keep warm. It was in this setting, several miles from any known trail, that I first heard the unmistakable sound of large footsteps breaking through the underbrush. Not the soft, careful steps of a deer, but heavy, deliberate, and coming from multiple directions. My heart raced. I froze, straining to see through the mist and dense trees. The steps stopped, then resumed, circling, coming closer. I could hear branches breaking under weight. The rational part of me considered animals, likely a bear, possibly two, but instinct screamed danger. I made a quick decision. I had read that sudden movement could provoke a predator, so I tried to appear calm, slowly backing toward a more open area where I could climb if necessary. The underbrush cracked louder, closer. I fumbled with my bear spray, heart pounding, adrenaline surging. Every instinct in me screamed to run, but running could trigger a chase. I tried to stay low, breathing steadily, scanning for a route that offered both visibility and cover. The sound of the creature or creatures grew closer. I caught glimpses through the mist, large, dark shapes moving with surprising speed and agility. Fear coursed through me, sharper than anything I had experienced on previous hikes or adventures. The realization hit that I might be surrounded, with no clear escape, no immediate way to defend myself beyond deterrent sprays and knives. Then, suddenly, a distant noise, a shout, not human but mechanical. I couldn't place it at first, but it was different from the organic sound of movement around me. I strained to listen and realized it was the faint hum of a helicopter. My pulse spiked, hope rising through the fear. I remembered that I had marked my route with GPS coordinates and had registered my hike with the local ranger station. The helicopter's presence suggested someone was looking for me, possibly alerted by my lack of check-in or by automated tracking from the trailhead. I made a snap decision. I ran downhill as quickly as I could, sliding and leaping over roots and rocks, keeping the sound of movement from the underbrush behind me. The mist limited visibility, but I kept moving, using every bit of energy. After what felt like hours, but was likely only minutes, I broke through a dense cluster of trees and saw the bright spotlights of the helicopter scanning the area. I waved my arms desperately, yelling, hoping they could see me. The helicopter lowered, a rope ladder dangling. Exhausted, muddy, and terrified, I scrambled toward it. My hands burned from gripping rocks and roots, my legs quivering from adrenaline and exertion. but I reached the clearing in time. The pilot shouted over the rotor noise, guiding me to grab the rope. I ascended slowly, muscles. I had planned this hike for months, mapping out a trail that was supposed to be challenging but manageable, one that would take me deep into a part of the forest I had never explored before. I wanted solitude, time away from the constant noise of the city, and the chance to test myself physically. The weather forecast was clear, with temperatures mild and little chance of rain, so I packed my gear carefully the night before, double-checking my backpack. I had my map, compass, extra food, water, first aid kit, and a flashlight, even though I didn't expect to need it. I also brought a small multi-tool, a whistle, and a fire starter just in case. I left a note with my location and planned return time with a friend as a safety measure. I told myself I would be careful, follow the trail markers, and not take unnecessary risks. The morning I started, the air was crisp and cool. The sky was bright with a few scattered clouds, and the sun was just rising, casting long, soft shadows across the ground. The trailhead was quiet, with no one around except for the occasional bird calling from the treetops. I began walking at a steady pace, enjoying the crunch of leaves under my boots and the faint smell of damp earth. At first, the trail was easy to follow. Painted markers on trees led me steadily through the forest. The incline was gentle, and I found a rhythm in my steps, the sound of my breathing and heartbeat becoming a sort of background music to the soft wind rustling the branches. After a couple of hours, the trail began to climb more sharply. The forest grew denser, the trees closer together, and the canopy above filtered the sunlight, leaving dim patches of light on the forest floor. Roots and rocks protruded from the ground, making the path uneven, and I had to pay close attention to where I placed each step. My legs ached slightly, my backpack pressing against my shoulders, but I kept moving, knowing that the higher I climbed, the better the view would be. Occasionally, I paused to drink water and rest, letting my eyes wander across the thick foliage, the moss-covered trunks, and the distant glimpses of hills beyond the trees. Around midday, I reached a small clearing. A few large rocks sat scattered across the ground, and I decided to stop and eat some of the snacks I had packed. I took out my water bottle, sitting on a rock, and ate a granola bar while watching the sunlight dapple through the branches. It was peaceful, and I felt a sense of satisfaction at how far I had come without any incidents. After resting for 20 minutes, I repacked my bag and continued along the trail, which now began to slope downward. The path narrowed, winding between thick underbrush and fallen trees. I had to duck under low branches and step carefully over tangled roots. The forest grew quieter here, the birds more distant, and the occasional rustle of leaves my only sound apart from my own footsteps. As the afternoon progressed, the trail became more difficult to navigate. Sections had eroded from recent rains, leaving slick mud and loose rocks. I moved slowly, testing each foothold before committing my weight, feeling the tension in my legs and feet with every careful step. At one point, I slipped slightly on a muddy incline, catching myself with my hands, my palms scraped and dirty, and I realized that I needed to pay even closer attention to the terrain. I was still following the trail markers, but the further I went, the less distinct they became. Moss and lichen covered some trees, obscuring the paint, and in some areas, branches and fallen leaves hid the ground. I had to rely on my map and compass more, checking frequently to make sure I was still heading in the right direction. By mid-afternoon, the sun had shifted, casting long shadows through the trees. I noticed that the air was cooler now, and a faint fog was beginning to rise from the forest floor. It wasn't thick enough to obscure my vision, but it made everything feel quieter, more isolated. I paused on a narrow section of trail that hugged a steep hillside. Looking down, I could see the slope dropping sharply, covered in loose rocks and undergrowth. I felt a twinge of unease and reminded myself to stay close to the center of the path. My mind began to wander, imagining the consequences of a misstep. The thought made my pulse quicken, but I shook it off and focused on the immediate task of walking safely. As I continued, the trail began to loop through a dense section of forest where the trees were older and taller. The ground was littered with fallen branches, pine cones, and thick layers of leaves. My boots made muffled sounds as I stepped, the soft earth absorbing most of the impact. Suddenly, I noticed an unusual smell. Damp, sharp, slightly metallic. I paused, scanning the area carefully. There was no obvious source, just a subtle change in the air that made me alert. I moved cautiously, keeping my eyes on the trail and the surrounding area. Occasionally, I would hear a snap of a twig, but there was no one else around. The forest seemed to hold its breath, every sound amplified in the quiet. A couple of hours later, I came to a point where the trail split. Both paths were narrow, overgrown, and partially obscured by underbrush. According to my map, one path would lead me to a small stream I wanted to see, while the other would loop back toward the main trail. I decided to take the path toward the stream, wanting to see the water and perhaps refill my bottle. I moved carefully, feeling the uneven ground beneath me, the soft mud sucking at my boots in some places, slippery roots in others. The further I went, the less distinct the trail markers became. I had to pause frequently, checking my compass and consulting my map. A growing sense of isolation began to settle over me. Eventually, I reached the stream. It was narrow but clear, water running over smooth rocks with a quiet, constant murmur. I knelt to drink, cupping my hands, and refilled my water bottle. For a few minutes, I sat on a nearby rock, enjoying the sound of the water and the cool shade of the trees. But as I rested, I realized something that made my heart tighten. I wasn't sure which way I had come from. The trail behind me was less obvious, partially hidden by fallen branches and brush. I had relied on the map, but the scale of the area and the density of the forest made it difficult to orient myself. I decided I needed to move cautiously and pay close attention to my bearings. I retraced my steps along the edge of the stream, trying to find the main trail again. The sun was beginning to dip lower, the light through the trees becoming muted and golden. Shadows grew longer, and the forest felt colder and more enclosed. I realized that I had been hiking for several hours since my last clear landmark and that the trail markers were becoming sparse. Anxiety crept in. I slowed my pace, checking my map and compass repeatedly, trying to align the terrain with what I remembered. I noticed that the ground sloped unevenly, with small ridges and dips that could easily mislead someone unfamiliar with the area. By late afternoon, I had walked a considerable distance without finding the main trail. My boots were caked with mud, my legs and shoulders aching, and my water supply had diminished. I felt the first real hint of fear, not panic, but a deep concern about my situation. I was in dense forest, the trail markers were few, and the light was fading. I reminded myself of my safety training. Slow down, stay put if necessary, conserve energy, and avoid rushing, which could lead to injury. I found a relatively flat area, a small clearing with a few fallen logs, and decided to stop and assess. I spread out my map, double-checked my compass, and tried to orient myself. After several tense minutes, I realized I had misjudged the distance I had traveled, and I was farther from the main trail than I thought. The sun continued its descent, and the forest darkened. Shadows deepened, and the shapes of trees and rocks grew more difficult to distinguish. I felt my pulse quicken as I realized I might have to spend the night in the forest. I hadn't planned for an overnight stay. My emergency gear was limited, and I had no tent or sleeping bag, only my backpack, extra layers, and a small tarp I had brought for temporary shelter. I began to gather supplies, choosing a flat area near a few sturdy trees that could offer some protection from wind and potential rain. I cleared away leaves and debris to create a small, level sleeping area and laid out my tarp, setting it up as a makeshift shelter. As darkness fell, the forest became completely silent except for the occasional rustle of small animals. The temperature dropped rapidly, and I pulled on extra layers, huddling under the tarp for warmth. I checked my water and rationed my remaining food. I felt a mix of fear and focus, fear of the unknown and of potential hazards, but focus on survival, which gave me a sense of control. I listened carefully for any sounds of larger animals and reassured myself that I was in no immediate danger, though I stayed vigilant. The night was long and tense. I woke several times, adjusting my position, listening to the wind in the trees, and making sure my shelter remained secure. Morning came slowly, the light filtering through the dense canopy. I felt exhausted but relieved to have made it through. I had planned the hike for months, mostly on my own, though I knew some people might think it reckless. It wasn't unusual for me to go out into the mountains alone. I had done it before, but this trip felt different from the start. I had chosen a trail deep in the northern range, one that wound through dense forests, crossed several streams, and climbed steep ridges. The trail was not heavily trafficked, which is exactly what I liked. I wanted isolation, the kind of quiet that forces you to listen to yourself and the forest around you. The weather forecast had been clear, and the maps said it was a 5-day loop. I packed carefully: extra food, water purification tablets, a detailed map, a compass, my sleeping bag, and a small stove. I carried more water than usual because I didn't want to rely on streams I hadn't seen before. The first day was uneventful. The trail was narrow, lined with thick pine and occasional birch. The smell of damp earth and pine needles filled the air. The path twisted and climbed, and by the time I reached the small clearing marked on my map as a resting point, my legs were sore, but I was energized by the sense of being completely removed from the city. I set up my small tent near a stream, careful to stay back from the water just in case it swelled overnight. I cooked a small meal of rice and canned beans, washed my dishes in the stream, and made sure everything was packed safely so I wouldn't attract animals. I went to sleep early, exhausted but content. The second day started with a crisp morning chill. I drank the last of my hot coffee, packed up, and headed deeper into the trail. The forest grew denser, darker in some parts, and the path became less obvious. I had to rely on the map and compass more often, stopping every few hundred meters to check my direction. Around mid-morning, I heard something move in the brush. It was probably a deer or some small animal, but it startled me because the sound came quickly and quietly, and there was no rustle of leaves beforehand. I paused and listened carefully, my heart racing slightly, then slowly moved forward, telling myself I was imagining things. By late afternoon, I reached a ridge that offered a wide view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking. The hills rolled for miles, the forest fading into a hazy green, and a river sparkled in the distance. I stopped to take some pictures, then followed the trail down toward a narrow canyon that the map indicated I would cross to continue the loop. The trail here was rougher. Loose rocks made every step precarious, and the slope on one side of the trail dropped sharply. I moved slowly, making sure each foot was planted securely. About halfway down, I saw a large animal track in the mud. Too big for a dog, too defined to be a deer. My stomach tightened, but I reminded myself I had seen mountain lions in tracking guides before, and that they were usually not a threat if you kept moving carefully. Late afternoon shadows lengthened, and I finally reached a small, flat area where I could set up camp for the night. I was tired, and the thought of sleeping in my tent under the trees sounded peaceful. I checked the stream nearby and filled my water container, filtered it carefully, and set up my stove to cook dinner. I noticed that my map showed another small trail that would take me to a waterfall the next day, a side excursion I hadn't planned on, but I felt adventurous and decided I would check it out in the morning. That night, I slept fitfully. I kept waking at small noises, the crack of a branch, the rustle of leaves, the occasional distant call of a bird. Around midnight, I thought I heard something moving near the edge of the clearing. Could have been a deer again or maybe a fox, but I felt uneasy. My flashlight illuminated the trees for a few meters, but there was nothing there. I forced myself to calm down, reminding myself I was in the forest, alone, which meant every sound was amplified. Eventually, exhaustion won, and I slept until dawn. Day 3 was when things began to go wrong. I started early, following the trail toward the waterfall. The forest thickened, and the path became almost indistinguishable. At one point, the trail split in 2 directions. I checked my compass and map several times, convinced I was on the right path. I took the left fork because it seemed to match the elevation change indicated on the map. Hours later, I realized I had made a mistake. The terrain didn't match the map. The slope was steeper than it should have been, and the soil was loose and slick from recent rain. I had no cell signal, of course, and I was now in a part of the forest I hadn't planned for. I tried to backtrack, but soon realized I wasn't sure where I had come from. Every tree looked similar. Every turn in the trail seemed familiar but different. My heart started racing as panic set in. I reminded myself to breathe, to slow down, and to think logically. I marked a tree with a small cut in the bark to know which direction I came from, and I decided to climb higher to see if I could spot the ridge or the river in the distance. It was a risk because the slope was steep, but it seemed like the only way to get my bearings. The climb was exhausting. Loose rocks slid under my feet, and I had to dig my boots into the soil to avoid slipping. My hands were scraped, and my legs burned. But eventually, I reached a small outcrop that offered a view. I could see the river far below, winding through the valley, but the ridge I had been aiming for was still obscured. It was at that moment I noticed something I had not considered: my food. I had packed enough for 5 days, but now I realized I had already eaten a significant portion, and the detour, the backtracking, and the extra exertion had burned more calories than expected. I had to be careful. I spent the rest of the day trying to find any sign of the trail. I marked trees as I moved, tried to follow animal tracks thinking they might lead to water or a clearer path, and climbed small ridges when I thought it might help me navigate. By late afternoon, I found a small, hidden stream. I drank carefully, ate a small portion of my remaining food, and considered making camp for the night. The sun was already low, and the thought of navigating in the dark terrified me. I set up my tent on a flat patch near the stream, knowing I might be woken by animals at night. That night was worse than the previous two. I could hear branches snapping in the distance, rocks rolling down slopes, and a low, continuous rustling that seemed closer than it should have been. I stayed inside my tent, flashlight close by, knife at hand. Sleep came in short bursts. I kept waking up to listen, to check if I could hear anything else, and to reassure myself that I was alone. Day 4 began with a grim realization. I was lost. I tried to trace my steps, but the forest had erased my path. Every tree, every boulder, every slope looked the same. I realized I would have to make a decision. Either try to follow the river downhill, which might lead to civilization, or climb higher again to find the ridge and possibly the main trail. I chose the river. It seemed safer. Even if it didn't lead to the trail, water meant survival. The hike down to the river was slow and treacherous. The ground was wet from early morning dew, loose stones made the path slippery, and I had to constantly check my footing. Along the way, I found signs of animals. Broken branches, paw prints, and some flattened grass, but nothing immediately threatening. Still, I felt watched, the kind of paranoia that comes from being completely isolated. I pushed forward. By midday, I reached the river. It was wider than I expected and flowed swiftly. Crossing it was impossible without a bridge or a safe shallow point. I decided to follow the riverbank downstream, hoping to find a trail or human presence. The terrain along the river was difficult. Dense vegetation, fallen trees, and occasional slippery mud banks. My legs were scratched, my boots soaked, and my muscles screaming from overexertion. But I pressed on. Hours later, I came across an abandoned hunting cabin. It was old, built from logs, with a small porch and a collapsed roof on one side. There was a rusted stove inside, some broken furniture, and an old metal container with remnants of food that had long since gone bad. The cabin offered shelter, and I took it. I set up my sleeping bag, cleaned a small area for cooking, and allowed myself to rest. That night, I slept more peacefully, exhausted from the relentless hiking, though I remained vigilant, listening for sounds outside. Day 5 was the turning point. I woke early, determined to find a way out. I had noticed tracks near the cabin, tire tracks from an old ATV and faint footprints that seemed recent. I followed them carefully, hoping they would lead to a road. The tracks took me along the river for hours, through thick brush, over small fallen logs, and past some steep embankments. I kept checking my map and compass as best I could, confirming my general direction. By late afternoon, I heard the unmistakable sound of a road. Relief washed over me, but it was cautious relief. I moved carefully, still aware that I was exhausted and vulnerable. The trail finally opened to a gravel road, and I saw an old truck parked ahead. A man in work clothes was walking toward it. I flagged him down, and he immediately understood I was lost and exhausted. He gave I had always loved hiking alone, the way it made me feel free, unbound, the quiet stretching around me like it belonged only to me. I had planned a hike for weeks, a trail far outside the usual paths, one that promised a mix of dense forest and rocky ridges. The maps suggested it wasn't particularly difficult, but the remoteness was what drew me. I wanted the solitude, the challenge, and the kind of raw calm that only comes when the world narrows down to the trail under your feet and the air around you. I started early in the morning before sunrise, when the first gray light seeped through the trees. The air was sharp and cold, and I could see my breath curling in tiny clouds. The trailhead was almost empty, a small dirt path that vanished quickly into the forest. My pack was heavy, not overly so, but filled with essentials. Water, some food, first aid, a small flashlight, a multi-tool, a compass, and extra layers. I had done my prep meticulously because I had a bad habit of overestimating my abilities. Today, I wanted to be cautious. The first hours were calm. The trail wound through tall pines, and the morning fog clung to the ground. It muffled sound, made the forest feel suspended in time. My boots crunched on the gravel and dried pine needles, and occasionally, I heard the distant call of birds or the rustle of small animals in the underbrush. The further I went, the narrower the trail became, and I had to duck under low branches or step over fallen trees. The scent of wet earth mixed with pine resin filled the air, comforting in a way, familiar. After 4 hours, I reached a small clearing, a rocky slope that gave me a view of the valley below. The sun had begun to rise fully now, streaking the forest with pale yellow light. I sat on a large boulder to drink water and snack on a granola bar. The wind was stronger here, colder, and it pushed against me, tugging at my jacket. I checked my map and compass. Everything seemed fine. The next section of trail was supposed to climb gradually, winding along the ridge before descending to a creek where I planned to refill my water. I set off again, feeling good. But as I moved, the forest changed subtly. The trees grew taller, denser. Shadows became longer even though the sun was higher. Fallen branches littered the path, and rocks jutted out more sharply. The trail was less defined, barely visible in some spots, and I realized I hadn't seen another hiker all morning. That's when a creeping sense of unease began to build. It wasn't fear yet, just awareness. Something about the isolation made me hyper-conscious of every sound. The snap of a twig, the flutter of leaves. By late morning, I reached the ridge. The wind was intense, whipping my hair and pulling at my jacket. The ground here was uneven, covered in loose rocks. I took each step carefully, testing the stones before putting my full weight down. The view was breathtaking. The valley spread below, rivers threading silver through green forests. But the trail was treacherous. Loose gravel and jagged stones meant that a single misstep could send me sliding down the slope. I kept reminding myself to stay focused, to move slowly. That's when I noticed it. A set of tracks, fresh, heading in the same direction I was going. I paused, bending to look closer. They were large, heavy, not like deer or any animal I recognized. The impressions were deep, and the spacing suggested a tall person, carrying weight. I felt a twinge of anxiety. Seeing tracks was normal, but these seemed odd, and I was suddenly aware of the silence. The forest felt heavier, the wind sharper, as though the ridge itself had closed in. I told myself it was just another hiker ahead, someone careful, perhaps working in forestry, or a hunter. Still, I made a mental note of the tracks and kept going, but I couldn't shake the prickling feeling on the back of my neck. Hours passed, and the trail became more difficult. Loose scree made each step a negotiation, each move deliberate. I was sweating despite the cold wind, muscles tiring from the climb. I found small resting points to sit and drink water, checking my compass frequently. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a narrow gap in the ridge, a place where the trail squeezed between two cliffs. The wind roared through here, and I had to grip rocks to steady myself. I glanced over the edge, a sheer drop to the valley floor. It was dizzying, a cold fear climbing my chest. I moved slowly, placing each foot with care, and focused on the next handhold, the next stone. That's when I realized the tracks were closer. Not far ahead, I could see the prints continuing along the rocks. But then, I noticed something strange. The prints weren't regular. Some were deeper, like the person had stumbled or dropped weight, and the spacing had grown uneven. My stomach tightened. Whoever had made these tracks was ahead, somewhere, and something had startled them. I debated turning back, but the ridge was narrow and turning around would be difficult. I pressed forward, heart hammering, senses heightened. By late afternoon, I reached a section where the trail descended sharply into a dense forest. Loose soil, fallen branches, and roots made the path treacherous. I took it slowly, bracing with my hands when needed, moving deliberately. Then I heard it, a rustle, the snap of a branch somewhere below the slope. My heart jumped. I froze, listening. The sound repeated, closer this time. My mind raced. It could be an animal, maybe a deer or a bear, though I doubted the latter. But I was alone, with nothing but my pack and the rocks beneath my feet, and the sounds of something or someone moving nearby. I decided to descend faster, carefully placing my feet but increasing speed where I could. The forest closed in, shadows lengthening as the sun dipped lower. My legs ached, but I couldn't stop. The idea of spending the night on the ridge, without proper shelter, alone, terrified me. I needed to reach the creek marked on my map before dark. Suddenly, a low sound reached me, almost a growl, but not quite. My mind jumped to worst-case scenarios. I strained to see through the undergrowth. Then, a figure emerged between the trees, tall, moving carefully. I froze. It wasn't wearing bright clothes, blending into the brown and green of the forest. My heart raced, and I felt a surge of panic, but I forced myself to stay calm. I couldn't outrun someone on this narrow, uneven trail. I considered climbing a tree or hiding, but the slope was steep, and the trees were thick and uneven. I decided my only option was to stay visible but keep moving steadily. I started moving again, slowly, carefully, not making sudden movements. The figure stayed behind me, maintaining a distance. I could hear the crunch of leaves and twigs, see the occasional flicker of movement in my peripheral vision. The forest seemed to shrink around me, claustrophobic. Every step felt like it echoed, though the air was thick and still. My hands gripped the straps of my pack, fingers tightening, knuckles white. By early evening, I reached the creek. The sound of running water was a relief, a lifeline. I bent down to fill my water bottle, feeling the chill of the cold water on my hands. The figure was still behind me, though farther now, watching, waiting, silent. I realized then that I had no idea who this person was or why they were following me. I considered running downstream, away from the trail, but the forest was dense, uneven, and I could easily get lost in the fading light. I decided my best chance was to keep moving along the map trail, maintain as much distance as possible, and remain aware. Night fell quickly in the forest. The light vanished almost at once, leaving only gray shadows. I turned on my flashlight, its beam cutting a narrow path through the darkness. The forest felt alive, every sound amplified. Water trickling over rocks, the wind whispering through leaves, distant branches snapping under invisible weight. My own breathing sounded loud in my ears. I moved cautiously, following the trail markers and checking my compass frequently. The figure was gone, or perhaps hidden, but the anxiety didn't leave me. Every shadow, every rustle made me tense. Hours passed. I had descended several hundred feet, following the creek downstream, hoping it would lead me to the main trail or a road. My legs were burning, my pack heavy, and my hands blistered from gripping rocks and roots. I stopped to rest briefly on a fallen tree trunk, drinking water and trying to calm my racing heart. I considered calling for help, but my phone had no signal. I felt the isolation fully now, the raw reality of being alone, lost, and potentially being watched. Eventually, after what felt like endless walking, I reached a wider section of the trail that matched a marked path on my map. Relief surged through me. I recognized the markers, and soon, faint lights appeared through the trees. Headlights from a distant road, civilization. My pace quickened, careful but purposeful, until I emerged onto a small parking area. A few cars were parked. I had been planning this hike for months. The mountains had always drawn me in with their quiet promise of solitude. The way the forest stretched endlessly and the trails wound through jagged ridges, rivers, and hidden valleys. This particular trail was far from any major park, off the map enough that few people ventured here. I liked the idea of being completely alone, surrounded by nothing but the natural world, where the only sounds were my footsteps, the wind, and the occasional bird. I had done long hikes before, but this one felt like a step further, remote, challenging, and unforgiving. I left early in the morning before sunrise, so the first few hours would be in the soft light of dawn. The air was crisp and cold, and I could see my breath as I moved along the narrow dirt path. The forest was dense, with towering pines and oaks whose roots tangled in the soil, creating natural obstacles I had to step over or around. The trail climbed gradually, winding around rocks and small streams. Everything seemed peaceful at first, almost too peaceful, as if the forest itself were holding its breath. I had my pack on my back, filled with the essentials: water, food, a small first aid kit, a flashlight, a map, and a compass. I knew the terrain was tricky, and I had told someone where I was going, though I didn't expect to see another person for miles. By mid-morning, the sun was higher, filtering through the trees in golden beams. The forest floor was damp from the night's dew, and the smell of wet earth and pine needles filled my senses. I was moving steadily, feeling the rhythm of my legs and breathing. The trail was still easy to follow, marked by worn patches of dirt and occasional ribbon markers tied to branches. I paused near a small creek to refill my water bottle and drink some of the cold, fresh water. I had been careful to avoid rushing, knowing that fatigue could lead to mistakes, especially in a remote area like this. As I moved deeper into the woods, the trail began to narrow and the incline increased. Rocks jutted from the ground, roots snaked across the path, and the trees grew closer together, blocking some of the sunlight. I felt a thrill of excitement mixed with a sense of caution. This is what I came for: the challenge, the isolation, the chance to test my limits. I noticed occasional signs of wildlife: claw marks on tree trunks, scat on the trail, and the distant echo of birds calling to each other. I was careful to step lightly, aware that sudden movements could startle an animal, but nothing approached. Around noon, the sun had climbed high, and the temperature had risen slightly. I found a flat area near a large boulder to rest and eat a small meal. I unpacked some trail mix and a protein bar, taking my time to drink water and stretch my legs. As I looked around, I realized the forest seemed quieter now. The usual sounds, the rustling of leaves, the distant calls of birds, the hum of insects, had all but vanished. I tried not to think too much about it, reminding myself that wildlife sometimes retreats during the heat of the day. After resting, I continued along the trail. It was steeper now, twisting between cliffs and ridges, with the ground sometimes loose and covered in small stones that shifted under my boots. I had to move carefully, testing each step to avoid slipping. I reached a section where the path ran along a narrow ledge above a drop of several hundred feet. My heart raced slightly, not from fear of the forest, but from the physical challenge and the awareness that one misstep could be catastrophic. I hugged the inner side of the trail, gripping the rough bark of trees for stability. Then, as I rounded a bend, I noticed something unusual. A part of the trail had collapsed, leaving a section of loose gravel and soil that looked unstable. The path ahead was jagged and uneven, and below, the slope fell sharply into a ravine. I paused, studying it. My instincts screamed caution, but I also knew turning back would take hours and might require retracing the steepest climbs I had already made. I carefully tested the ground with my boots, moving slowly. The gravel shifted underfoot, and a small rock tumbled down the slope. My stomach tightened. One wrong move here would be dangerous. I took a deep breath and started edging along the unstable section, placing my feet deliberately and keeping my center of gravity low. My pack felt heavy, pulling me backward, and the sweat on my hands made it difficult to grip the trees. I focused entirely on each movement, trying not to let fear dictate my pace. Halfway through, I slipped slightly, my foot sliding on loose gravel. My heart pounded, and I froze, gripping the tree branch next to me. It held, but I could feel how precarious the situation was. I inched forward, slow and careful, until I reached the solid ground on the other side. My legs shook as I stood upright, relieved but aware that the danger wasn't over. After the narrow ledge, the trail continued uphill, though less treacherous. I kept a steady pace, my eyes scanning for any hazards. By late afternoon, I reached a plateau that offered a view of the valley below. The sight was breathtaking. The forest stretched out like a vast green ocean, rivers glinting in the sunlight, distant ridges fading into the haze. I paused to drink water and rest, taking in the quiet majesty. But as I sat, I realized something troubling. The sun was already leaning toward the horizon, and I was further from my planned campsite than I had intended. I checked my map and compass. My original route had included a turn onto a smaller trail leading to a flat area near a stream where I could set up camp. But in the last few hours, I had misjudged the terrain, and the trail markings were now scarce. The dense forest and uneven ground made it difficult to locate the path. I started walking carefully, trying to find the correct turn, but the undergrowth was thick, and the forest seemed to close in around me. The daylight was fading faster than I expected. By the time the sun touched the tops of the trees, I realized I was lost. Panic flickered briefly, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew that fear could cloud judgment. I checked my compass and attempted to orient myself, trying to remember landmarks I had passed earlier. The trail markings were almost non-existent, and I had no way to tell if I was moving closer to my campsite or further away. I decided to head in the direction that seemed most likely to lead to the plateau I had passed, reasoning that open space would allow me to see better and make navigation easier. The forest became darker quickly. Shadows lengthened, and the light filtering through the trees grew dim. I kept moving, but every step was uncertain. Roots and rocks became hidden in the low light, and I stumbled several times, scraping my hands and legs. I realized that even a minor injury could become dangerous in these conditions. I tried to keep calm, repeating to myself that I could survive if I stayed cautious and methodical. After what felt like hours, I came across a narrow stream cutting through the forest. The water was shallow but fast-moving, and it reflected the last glimmers of sunlight. I followed the stream, hoping it might lead to a larger body of water or an open area where I could set up camp. The ground along the stream was slippery, and I slipped several times, soaking my boots and legs. Each fall reminded me of how quickly circumstances could turn dangerous. Night fell fully, and the forest became almost entirely dark. I switched on my flashlight, the beam cutting a narrow path through the trees. Every rustle and crack of a branch made me tense, imagining the consequences if I fell or got injured. I knew that in this remote area, help would be hours away at best and possibly days. I kept moving, focusing on the stream as my guide, until I reached a small clearing. It was not ideal, but it was flat enough to set down my pack and attempt to rest. I built a small fire from nearby branches, careful to keep it contained. The warmth was comforting, and the light pushed back the darkness enough for me to assess my situation. I was tired, cold, and soaked from the falls, but I was alive. I knew that staying put until daylight would be safer than wandering in the dark. I ate a small amount of food, drank water, and wrapped myself in my jacket and blanket. The sounds of the forest at night were eerie. The wind rustling leaves, the distant call of an owl, the splashes of water from the stream. But I forced myself to focus on my breathing and stay calm. The night passed slowly. Every time I moved in my sleep, the uneven ground reminded me of how careful I had to be. When dawn came, the forest looked less threatening, but the danger was still real. I unpacked, checked my supplies, and planned my next move. I retraced my steps along the stream, moving slowly and deliberately until I recognized a bend in the trail from the previous day. Relief washed over me as I realized I was back on a known path. I followed the trail through the forest, carefully navigating obstacles, and by mid-morning I reached the plateau where I had rested the day before. From there, the rest of the trail was familiar though still challenging. I moved steadily, resting occasionally and keeping hydrated. The sunlight was strong, and the forest I had been planning this hike for weeks. I usually liked long, solitary treks, the kind that left you exhausted, dirty, and quietly proud at the end of the day. My route was ambitious, a loop through a rugged section of the forest I had never explored before. The trailhead started at a small, nondescript parking lot off a narrow mountain road. Early in the morning, the air was crisp and carried that earthy smell of damp pine and wet soil. I loaded my backpack, making sure the essentials were there: water, extra food, a first aid kit, a flashlight with fresh batteries, a compass, and a small map I had photocopied from an old guidebook. The trail began gently, winding through a stand of tall pines. I could hear the soft rustling of leaves as squirrels moved among the branches, and the distant gurgle of a stream somewhere below the slope. The morning sun dappled through the trees, casting shifting patches of light on the moss-covered ground. It was quiet, peaceful, and I felt that familiar sense of freedom that hiking alone always gave me. By mid-morning, the trail steepened. I had to climb over fallen logs and navigate around muddy patches where rain from a few days earlier had pooled in the hollows. The forest felt wilder here, less touched by human presence. Birds called to each other in unfamiliar patterns, and the air smelled sharper, cooler, filled with the scent of pine resin and damp earth. I kept my pace steady, stopping occasionally to catch my breath and take small sips of water. As I ascended, I noticed the trail markers were becoming less frequent. The painted blazes on the trees were faint and sometimes partially hidden by moss. I slowed down, paying closer attention to the ground and the trees. The forest was quiet, in a different way now, almost heavy, as if the sounds of the valley below hadn't yet reached this height. Around noon, I reached a small clearing with a view of the mountains stretching endlessly. I took a long break here, eating a small sandwich and drinking water. The solitude was exhilarating, but I also felt a tiny pang of unease, the kind you feel when you're alone somewhere remote. I pressed on, following the faint trail that led into denser forest. Soon, I realized the trail was disappearing entirely. My map showed that the path should turn sharply to the left, but all I saw was an unbroken wall of underbrush and fallen trees. I tried to retrace my steps to find the last marker, but the forest floor had eroded, leaving only a rough, uneven slope. I could feel my anxiety rising slightly, but I reminded myself that I had prepared for situations like this. I checked my compass and tried to orient myself, but the terrain made it difficult. I decided to push forward, staying as close to the map's path as I could. The forest grew darker as the trees thickened, and I had to duck under low-hanging branches and climb over fallen logs. My boots slipped on wet leaves, and I scraped my hands against rough bark more than once. After about an hour, I found a small stream cutting across my path. I followed it upstream, reasoning that it would eventually intersect with a trail or a landmark I could recognize. The stream was shallow, but the rocks were slippery, and I had to be careful with each step. As I followed the water, the light began to change. The sun was lower now, filtering through the dense canopy in long, slanting beams. Shadows stretched across the ground, and I realized that I had misjudged the time. I had at least 2 hours of daylight left at best, maybe less, and I was still deep in unmarked forest. The thought made my stomach tighten. Suddenly, I noticed something strange. The stream widened slightly, and I could see signs of previous human presence. A flattened area that might have been a campsite, scraps of cloth, and what looked like a discarded water bottle. My first reaction was relief. Maybe someone had been this way recently, and I could find a trail if I followed their path. I followed the stream cautiously, scanning for more signs, but as I moved, I realized the ground was uneven and the bank on my right was steep. I slipped on a patch of mud and barely managed to grab a tree root, twisting my ankle painfully. I sat down for a moment, trying to steady myself. My ankle was sore, but it seemed stable. I had tape in my backpack, so I wrapped it as best as I could, though it didn't provide much support. I realized that my progress would be slower now, and the sun was dropping quickly. Shadows lengthened, and the forest seemed to change around me. The sounds of birds and insects quieted, replaced by the distant creaking of branches and the occasional crack of a twig under some unseen weight. I felt that familiar prickling of fear, the sense that I was not just alone but truly isolated. I kept moving, forced by necessity more than confidence. The stream eventually led me to a small rock ledge, where the drop on one side was steep and the other side was a dense thicket of trees. I carefully navigated along the edge, gripping rocks and roots, trying to maintain my balance. The light was fading fast, and I realized that I had no chance of reaching a recognizable trail before dark. I considered setting up a temporary camp, but the ledge was small and exposed. Then I saw it: tracks. Fresh, large, and unmistakable. Bare tracks, pressed deeply into the soft mud by the stream. My heart jumped into my throat. I knew I was in grizzly country, and while attacks were rare, being surprised in dense forest was extremely dangerous. I froze, listening. The forest was silent except for the stream. I could see the impressions clearly. There were at least 2 sets moving upstream. I backed away slowly, trying not to make noise, and looked for higher ground. I spotted a thick cluster of trees on a small rise that could give me some cover and a better vantage point. Carefully, I climbed the slope, testing each branch and root to ensure it could support me. By the time I reached the top, the sun was almost gone. I could hear the stream below and, faintly, the sounds of something moving among the trees. I decided to stay put and wait, hoping the bear had moved on. Night fell completely. The forest around me became a black wall. I used my flashlight sparingly, pointing it only at the ground near my feet to avoid attracting attention. I could hear the forest alive with nocturnal sounds: insects buzzing, owls calling, and small animals rustling. I stayed absolutely still, occasionally checking the slope below me. Hours passed slowly. My stomach growled, my ankle throbbed, and fatigue set in, but I didn't dare move far. Around midnight, I heard a noise that made my heart nearly stop. A low, guttural growl followed by the snapping of a branch. The bear was nearby. I froze, trying to remain as quiet as possible. I reminded myself of everything I had learned about bear encounters. Don't run, stay calm, make yourself known if necessary. But for now, I just waited, barely breathing, as the sounds of movement passed slowly by the slope below me. Eventually, after what felt like hours, the sounds faded, and I realized the bear had moved on, likely following the stream or searching for food elsewhere. I didn't sleep. I stayed in my hiding spot until the first hints of dawn. I needed to get out before the bear came back. Using the light of the early morning, I assessed my options. The trail was still missing, but I could navigate using the sun and my compass. I decided to head east, knowing it would eventually bring me to a road or more familiar terrain according to my map. Each step was slow and careful, especially with my twisted ankle, but I moved steadily. By mid-morning, I reached a ridge that gave me a view of the valley below. I could see a faint line that looked like a dirt road winding through the trees. Relief washed over me. The forest was still dense, but the sense of isolation had lifted slightly. I descended carefully, keeping my eye out for wildlife, and eventually, after several more hours of cautious trekking, I reached the road. A car passed by, and I waved frantically, grateful for the sight of another human being. I flagged it down, explaining as best as I could that I was injured and had been lost overnight. The driver helped me get to the nearest ranger station. I was treated for dehydration, minor cuts, and my ankle was wrapped properly. The rangers checked the area I had been in and confirmed bear activity, warning that the trails I had attempted were particularly hazardous due to recent sightings and terrain difficulties. I left the forest that day with a mix of relief, exhaustion, and a deep respect for the raw, unpredictable power of nature. I had survived, but I knew it had been a close call. I kept the experience to myself mostly, only telling a few close friends, and I never returned to that trail. The memory of those dark hours, alone, injured, and aware of a massive predator nearby, stayed with me. It changed the way I approached hiking forever. Careful planning, respect for wildlife, and humility in the face of nature's indifference. Even now, months later, I can close my eyes and hear the sound of the stream, the snap of a branch, the low growl carried on the cold night air. I survived because I stayed calm, stayed aware, and trusted the I had planned this hiking trip for months, going over every detail, checking maps, reading trail reviews, and making lists of equipment. I knew the trail I chose was considered challenging. Long, steep sections, loose rocks, dense forest, and remote areas. But I had hiked before, and I liked pushing myself. The night before, I laid out all my gear. Boots, socks, multiple layers of clothes, backpack, first aid kit, compass, map, plenty of water, energy bars, and a small flashlight. I double-checked everything, down to the batteries in my flashlight. I wanted to be ready. I always wanted to be ready. I thought preparation was the difference between enjoying a hike and ending up in a disaster story. I felt confident. The morning I left, the air was crisp, the sky bright blue with scattered clouds. The forest smelled damp but fresh. I started early, just after sunrise, following the narrow dirt trail that wound steeply upward. The first few miles were relatively easy, and I made good time. The incline was steady, and I could hear birds in the trees, the occasional rustle of small animals, and the wind brushing through the leaves. I drank water often, kept my pace measured, and admired the view as it opened up in patches through the dense trees. Everything felt right, exactly as it should for a solo hike. I passed a small stream where I filled one of my water bottles, careful to filter the water with my portable filter. It was quiet and calm, and I felt a strange comfort in the solitude. This is what I loved: the isolation, the physical challenge, the clarity of mind. By late morning, the trail began to change. The forest thickened, the incline became steeper, and the ground turned from dirt to loose rocks. Some areas had fallen branches and moss-covered stones that made footing tricky. I slowed my pace, testing each step carefully. My legs ached slightly, but nothing serious, and I reminded myself to breathe and stay focused. I kept glancing at my map and compass, making mental notes of landmarks so I could navigate back if I needed to. Around noon, I reached a ridge with a wide view of the valley below. I stopped to rest, eat a snack, and drink water. From there, I could see other sections of the trail winding upward, mostly through dense forest. Everything was as expected. I felt tired but capable. After resting, I continued. The trail narrowed, winding between boulders and fallen trees. The incline was now steep enough that I had to use my hands to steady myself on some sections. I remembered reading that this part could be slippery after rain, but it had been dry for several days, so I assumed it would be safe. Still, I moved carefully, testing rocks and roots before putting my full weight on them. As I climbed higher, I began noticing subtle changes. The air felt colder, damper, and heavier. The trail markings became less frequent, faded, or covered by moss. I thought this was normal. Some sections were less maintained, but I also made a mental note to pay attention. It's easy to get complacent when you've been hiking solo for hours. Around mid-afternoon, I reached a junction in the trail. The map showed two paths, one continuing the main ascent, the other branching slightly off toward a small, less traveled route. The branch was supposed to be a shortcut to a scenic viewpoint I wanted to see. I double-checked my map, convinced I could take it safely. The main trail was longer, but I wanted that viewpoint, so I turned onto the smaller path. The terrain immediately became more uneven. Rocks were loose, roots more frequent, and the slope steeper. Still, I kept going, careful with each step, moving slowly. After about half an hour, the trail became almost unrecognizable in parts. Fallen trees blocked sections, and moss-covered rocks made footing treacherous. I stopped often to reassess my direction with the map and compass. I thought I was still on course. Then, around 3 in the afternoon, I noticed something unsettling. The trail markers, painted blazes on trees, were disappearing. Where there should have been a marker, there was only bare bark. I checked my compass and map, trying to realign myself, but the dense trees made it hard to see the sun or any distant landmarks. My heart began to pick up slightly, a tension building I didn't immediately recognize. I told myself it was fine. I had my compass, my map, my gear, my experience. I could navigate. I just had to stay calm. I pressed on, but soon the trail forked again, this time with no markings at all. I hesitated. My map showed a path in roughly the right direction, but there were no signs on the ground. I considered turning back, but I thought I knew enough to move carefully. I chose what looked like the most plausible path. Almost immediately, the terrain worsened. Loose rocks gave way underfoot, and small slides occurred as I shifted my weight. The trees were thick, branches scraping my arms. My boots slipped on moss-covered stones. The sound of the wind in the trees had grown louder, more ominous, like a warning I didn't fully recognize yet. My stomach tightened, a low, creeping anxiety that I tried to ignore. I told myself this was just the difficulty of the trail. By late afternoon, I realized I had been walking in circles. The same large rock formations appeared multiple times, unmistakable. I checked my compass, my map, retraced steps in my mind, but everything seemed wrong. Paths I thought I had taken didn't match the map. The trail seemed to have disappeared entirely, blending into the forest. My pace slowed drastically as I tried to figure out what had gone wrong. I was still confident I could find my way, but the certainty I felt in the morning was gone. My water supply was enough for the day, but I knew I had hours ahead of me, and possibly more than I expected if I got lost. The sun was beginning to dip lower, casting long shadows through the dense forest. My anxiety grew as I realized I might not have enough daylight to find a clear path back. The idea of spending the night on this steep, unfamiliar terrain unsettled me. I had a flashlight, yes, but I knew how dangerous a night in these conditions could be. Hypothermia, injury, getting stuck. I kept telling myself to stay calm, to think, to observe, but a creeping panic made my thoughts jittery. My hands were sweating inside my gloves as I adjusted my backpack. I tried to remember survival tips. Stay put if lost, conserve energy, find a safe spot if night comes. But I was still hoping to find the main trail before that. I pushed forward carefully, testing every step. I climbed over fallen logs, around boulders, and through thick underbrush. Every now and then, I thought I saw a trail, but it vanished as quickly as it appeared. My boots were scuffed, my legs scraped, and I was sweating heavily despite the cooling air. The forest now felt oppressive. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. I tried to focus on practical navigation, but the sun was dropping quickly behind the mountains. Soon, I knew I would lose light entirely. By the time the sun was a faint glow behind the ridges, I realized I had to stop moving blindly. I needed a plan. I found a small clearing, a flat section of ground free of rocks, relatively sheltered by trees. I set down my backpack, checked my supplies, and made a quick inventory. I had enough water for another day if I rationed it, enough food for a day and a half, my first aid kit, flashlight with 2 extra batteries, a small fire starter kit, and a lightweight emergency blanket. I also had my compass and map, although at this point I wasn't entirely sure which direction would lead to safety. My hands trembled slightly as I organized my gear, trying to calm myself. I decided to make a fire, both for warmth and as a signal in case someone came looking for me. Gathering dry sticks and branches was harder than it seemed. The ground was damp, and most small wood was soaked or moss-covered. After struggling, I managed a small fire using kindling and my fire starter. The light felt like a small island of safety in the surrounding darkness. I stayed close, feeding it gradually, but keeping it manageable so it wouldn't get out of control. The fire gave me a strange comfort, but I knew it wasn't a permanent solution. I would need to move in daylight. For now, I set up my emergency blanket and slept near the fire in short stretches, listening to the night sounds of the forest. The wind in the trees, the distant calls of animals, the occasional falling branch. Sleep came fitfully, interrupted by nerves and the cold. The next morning, I woke before sunrise. The first task was to get my bearings. I used the compass, my map, and the direction of the rising sun to orient myself. I noticed faint animal tracks in the damp soil and decided to follow them for a while. They might lead to water or a clearer path. After walking slowly for an hour, I stumbled upon a narrow trail, barely visible, partially overgrown, but clearly used. Relief washed over me. I kept moving carefully, staying alert. The terrain remained steep and treacherous, but the trail gave me confidence. I climbed, slipped, regained balance, and pushed forward, knowing I was heading in the right general direction. Hours later, I had always loved hiking alone. There was something about the silence, the sense of isolation, and the challenge of navigating rugged terrain that made me feel alive. That particular weekend, I decided to tackle a trail that had a reputation for being remote and difficult. It was supposed to be one of the lesser-known paths in the northern mountains, a stretch that few people dared to attempt. The trail was unmarked in most places, and the maps were vague at best. I packed lightly, carrying only the essentials: a small backpack with water, some trail mix, a first aid kit, a flashlight, a multi-tool, and a jacket. My phone had limited reception, but I told myself that part of the adventure was going off-grid, relying on my own skills and instincts. The morning started out clear and crisp, the kind of cold air that makes your lungs burn just a little when you inhale deeply. The forest was dense at the base of the trail, with pine trees so thick that sunlight barely touched the forest floor. I stepped carefully over tangled roots and rocks, listening to the faint rustle of leaves and the distant calls of birds. The first couple of miles went smoothly. The trail was steep, but I was fit and experienced. I kept a steady pace, stopping occasionally to catch my breath and admire the view through the gaps in the trees. From those small openings, I could see the valley below, rivers winding like silver threads, and distant peaks dusted with snow. As I climbed higher, the forest became quieter. Birds disappeared, and the wind through the trees sounded sharper, almost hollow. The trail narrowed, and I had to navigate jagged rocks and loose gravel. Around midday, I reached a small plateau with a panoramic view. I took out my water and ate a few handfuls of trail mix, feeling a sense of satisfaction at reaching this point alone. But even as I sat there, enjoying the view, a subtle unease began to creep in. The forest below was dense, unbroken, and I realized that there were no signs of other hikers anywhere. No distant voices, no movement, nothing. Just the wind and the occasional creak of trees. I resumed my climb, following a faint path that veered away from the main trail according to my map. This section was less traveled. Branches snagged my jacket, and the trail was often just a suggestion rather than a clearly marked route. At some point, I stepped onto a stretch of loose gravel on a steep incline. I slipped briefly, catching myself against a jagged rock. My heart pounded, not from exertion, but from the sudden awareness of how exposed I was. One misstep here could mean a serious fall, and there was no one around to help. Hours passed. I kept moving, sometimes slowly, sometimes pushing harder to make better time. The sun dipped lower, filtering through the treetops in long, golden beams. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trees. I had planned to make it to a small ridge by nightfall, where I intended to set up camp. But as the trail wound through a particularly dense section, I realized I had lost the faint markings I was following. The terrain was uneven, and I began second-guessing my direction. I stopped, unpacked my compass, and tried to orient myself. The readings were correct, but the landscape looked almost identical in every direction. Trees, rocks, undergrowth, it was disorienting, and my sense of distance was failing me. A subtle panic began to rise. I was experienced, but the isolation combined with the fading light made me feel vulnerable in a way I hadn't in years. I knew the sun would set soon, and navigating these rocky, unmarked paths in darkness was dangerous. I increased my pace, scanning the ground constantly for stability. I had only a flashlight as a backup, and I didn't want to rely on it too early, conserving battery in case I truly got stuck. Then I heard it, a faint, scraping sound, distant but deliberate. At first, I thought it was a falling branch or rock, but it repeated, slow and steady. My pulse quickened. The sound seemed to echo through the trees, moving closer. I froze, listening. It stopped. I told myself it was probably just the wind shifting branches, but the feeling of being watched lingered. I moved cautiously, hugging the hillside, my eyes darting between trees and rocks. Every crackling leaf or snapping twig made me tense. The forest was no longer peaceful. It felt alive in a way that made my stomach tighten. I realized I had to make a decision. Continue along the path, hoping to find the ridge before dark, or turn back and try to retrace my steps. Turning back meant descending over treacherous slopes I had just climbed, but staying forward risked navigating unknown terrain in failing light. I chose to move forward, keeping my pace controlled, forcing myself to focus on the trail. I told myself I had done longer hikes alone, and I could handle this. By late afternoon, the sunlight became thin, almost gray. Shadows stretched unnaturally between the trunks. The scraping noise returned, closer this time, echoing along the rocks like deliberate steps. I had no idea what it was. My imagination raced through possibilities. Wild animals, falling rocks, other hikers. But the rhythm didn't match any natural pattern I recognized. I gripped my multi-tool, a useless comfort, but something tangible in my hands. My senses sharpened. Every movement, every sound felt magnified. I became hyper-aware of every snapping twig under my feet, the rustle of the wind, the occasional bird that refused to stop moving. Hours passed. Darkness began to settle like a heavy blanket. The dense trees made the sky almost invisible. I realized I had no clear landmarks to guide me, and the trail had disappeared entirely. Panic surged again, but I forced myself to stay calm. I stopped, sat on a flat rock, and assessed my situation. I had water, some food, a flashlight, and a compass. I was cold, my muscles were sore, but I was not injured. The sensible choice was to stay put until I could see better, or until I could figure out a safe path down. I tried to mark my location mentally. I recalled a small stream I had passed earlier, and I knew if I could find water, I could follow it downhill. I switched on my flashlight briefly, scanning the area. The beam cut through the darkness, revealing the same unbroken forest. There was no path, no indication of direction, just trees and rocks. I realized then how isolated I truly was. This wasn't a fear of ghosts or supernatural things. It was the raw, primal fear of being lost, exposed, and vulnerable in a vast, indifferent wilderness. I had been planning this hike for months. I live in a city where everything is built up and loud, and I needed the isolation of the mountains. I wanted to be completely alone for at least a week, to disconnect from people, noise, and the constant stream of notifications that follow you everywhere. I packed carefully. My backpack was heavy but organized, filled with enough water, dehydrated food, a small stove, a first aid kit, a sleeping bag, extra clothing, and navigation tools, including a map and compass. My phone had no signal in the area I planned to explore, and I liked it that way. I wanted to rely entirely on my own skills. I double-checked everything, from the water filter to the headlamp, before leaving early one morning when the sun was still low, casting long shadows across the asphalt roads of the city. The drive was long, winding through highways that gradually became narrow, empty roads lined with dense forest. At some point, the asphalt ended and was replaced by dirt, and I parked my car at the small lot that marked the trailhead. There were signs warning hikers of rugged terrain and sudden weather changes, but they were general warnings. I had studied the trail extensively on maps and online forums, so I believed I was well prepared. I strapped on my backpack, tested the weight on my shoulders, and started walking. The trail began gently, winding through tall pine trees and occasional clearings. The air was clean, cold, and smelled of wet soil and pine needles. Birds chirped intermittently, and a faint wind rustled the leaves. The first day passed without incident. I took it slow, savoring the solitude and the sound of nothing except the forest itself. By late afternoon, I reached a small stream that ran parallel to the trail. I set down my pack, took off my boots, and dipped my feet in the cold, clear water. I filtered some water into my bottles, rested, and then continued until I found a flat area for my camp. I set up my small tent, cooked a simple meal, and lay down on my sleeping pad. The darkness fell quickly, and I could hear distant animal calls. I slept lightly, aware of every small sound, as hikers often do on the first night. The second day was where the difficulty began. The trail became steeper, rocky, and overgrown in parts. I used my hiking poles to steady myself, carefully placing each foot to avoid slipping on loose gravel or wet moss. Around midday, the clouds rolled in unexpectedly, and the air grew cooler and damp. I put on my rain jacket and kept moving, trying not to let the weather slow me too much. The map indicated a small ridge I could reach by late afternoon, which would be an excellent spot to camp, with a view over the valley. By the time I reached it, the clouds had thickened, making the valley below almost invisible. I set up camp quickly, aware that rain could fall any moment. I ate, organized my gear, and slept cautiously, alert to the sound of shifting branches, imagining how a falling limb could crush the tent if I slept carelessly. It was on the third day that I realized the trail was going to be far more dangerous than I anticipated. I had planned to cross a section of rocky terrain known for loose stones and hidden crevices. As I began the ascent, the ground beneath me shifted unexpectedly. My foot slid into a shallow gap between rocks, twisting my ankle painfully. I gritted my teeth, testing my weight carefully. It wasn't broken, but it was sprained badly enough to make walking difficult. I stopped immediately and assessed my options. I could either try to continue slowly to the next safe spot or retreat the way I came. Retreat meant retracing nearly 2 days of hiking back over rough terrain with a sprained ankle. I decided to continue, relying on my poles for support, careful not to slip. As I progressed, the weather worsened. Rain started lightly at first, then heavier, turning the rocky path slippery. Water ran down the rocks in small streams, and I had to test each foothold before moving. At one point, a heavy drop of water fell directly on my hand, making me lose balance. I braced myself on a nearby boulder, heart pounding. The exposure of the ridge meant that any fall could be fatal, and the thought made my movements even more deliberate. I could feel tension building in my shoulders and neck, the kind that comes when every step is a careful calculation of risk and survival. By late afternoon, exhausted and soaked, I finally reached a narrow plateau that offered some safety from the slick rocks. I set my pack down, my ankle throbbing, my clothes soaked. I realized I needed to make camp quickly or risk a night exposed to the elements. The only flat space was minimal, just enough for my tent, and it bordered a steep drop. I set it up with extreme care, securing every stake and checking that the fabric wouldn't tear in the wind. I huddled inside, eating a small meal, trying to keep my morale up. The rain didn't let up, and the wind began to howl across the plateau, shaking my tent violently. Night was difficult. Every sound, rain slapping the fabric, rocks shifting, wind whistling past the ridges, felt amplified. Sleep was shallow, broken by the need to check the stability of the tent and ensure my ankle hadn't shifted painfully. The storm continued until dawn, and by morning, the ground was slick and muddy, the air cold and heavy. I decided I could no longer continue along the planned route. My ankle would not allow me to descend the steep rocks safely, and moving forward into unfamiliar terrain was equally dangerous. I had to call for help. I had left my phone on airplane mode to save battery, but in a desperate move, I turned it on. Miraculously, I had 1 bar of signal. I dialed the emergency number, giving my approximate location as best I could, and explained my sprained ankle. Rescue arrived faster than I expected. A Ranger helicopter spotted me within an hour. They hovered over the plateau, carefully lowering a rescuer on a rope. The wind made the operation tense, and I watched every movement with sharp attention, knowing a single mistake could mean disaster. The rescuer reached me, secured me in a harness, and I was lifted slowly into the helicopter. My body was sore, my ankle throbbing, but I felt immense relief. As we lifted away, I could see the treacherous path I had traversed, the slick rocks, the rain-soaked terrain, the isolation. I realized how quickly a single mistake could have turned fatal. At the hospital, after my ankle was treated and bandaged, I reflected on the experience. The hike had been dangerous, unpredictable, and exhausting, yet it was completely real. No ghostly apparitions, no exaggerated fears, just raw nature, its challenges, and the consequences of underestimating them. I realized that my careful planning had saved me, as had my decision-making in the moment. I had survived because I respected the environment and accepted the limits of my body and equipment. Over the next weeks, I healed slowly. I walked carefully, strengthening my ankle, and I documented the entire hike in detail, noting the points where I had been lucky, where the terrain had been riskier than the maps suggested, and how minor injuries could become serious problems. The experience changed the way I approached hiking. I still loved the mountains, but I understood that danger was real, and preparation alone was not enough. You also had to pay attention, make cautious choices, and be ready to ask for help when survival demanded it. The mountains were beautiful, but they were indifferent to human plans. That lesson stayed with me. From that hike onward, I never underestimated a trail, never ignored weather changes, and never thought I could do more than my body allowed. It wasn't a story of heroic survival or dramatic heroics. It was about facing real danger, staying calm, and using reason to guide every step. I often think back to the narrow plateau, the wind tearing at my tent, the rain soaking through my jacket, and I realize that fear isn't about imagination. It's about respect for reality. And respecting reality had kept me alive. I had always considered myself an experienced hiker. I had spent years traversing trails across different states, climbing through mountain passes, and camping alone in dense forests. The sense of solitude, of being surrounded only by nature, had always appealed to me. It was a way to disconnect, to feel fully alive. But that particular trip, the one I would never forget, became the most terrifying experience of my life, and it began in the most ordinary way. I had planned a solo hike in the northern part of the state, in a mountainous area known for its thick forests and remote trails. It was late summer, and the weather reports promised clear skies, though temperatures would drop sharply at night. I had studied maps and trail guides for weeks, plotted my route, and packed my gear meticulously. I carried a sturdy backpack filled with essentials: a tent, sleeping bag, stove, food supplies, a first aid kit, extra clothing, and plenty of water. I also had a GPS device, although I always preferred navigating with a paper map and compass. I set out early in the morning, the forest still damp with the remnants of overnight dew. Birds chirped faintly, and the air smelled of pine and wet earth. The trail started gently, winding through dense woods, and I felt the familiar thrill of anticipation. The first few hours passed without incident. Sunlight filtered through the canopy in soft golden beams, illuminating patches of moss and small wildflowers along the path. I stopped occasionally to take photographs and rest, savoring the quiet and the rhythm of my steps. By midday, I reached a small clearing atop a ridge, offering a panoramic view of the surrounding mountains. I could see valleys far below, rivers glinting in the sun, and distant peaks shrouded in light mist. I stopped to eat a simple lunch, bread, cheese, and some dried fruit, and refilled my water bottle at a small spring I had found nearby. I felt confident and energized. This was the kind of hiking I loved. Challenging enough to demand attention, but peaceful enough to allow reflection. I resumed my hike, heading toward a section of the trail that descended sharply into a narrow canyon. This part of the route was less traveled, and I quickly realized why. The path was rocky and uneven, with loose stones that made footing precarious. The canyon walls rose steeply on either side, covered with dense undergrowth and tangled roots. The trail narrowed until, at some points, it was little more than a ledge along the cliff face. I moved slowly, carefully testing each step. It was mid-afternoon when I heard the first unusual sound. At first, I thought it was just the wind rustling through the trees, but then I noticed something else. A faint, distant sound, rhythmic and deliberate, like someone or something moving carefully through the underbrush. My heart rate quickened slightly, though I told myself it was probably an animal. Deer or maybe a fox. The forest was full of wildlife. As I continued down the trail, the sound seemed to follow me, faint but persistent. Every time I paused, it stopped. Every time I resumed walking, it began again. I tried to ignore it, focusing on the trail and the precarious footing. But soon, I realized the terrain was becoming more dangerous. Loose rocks shifted under my boots, and a few times I almost lost my balance. The walls of the canyon felt oppressive, closing in from both sides, and the path ahead was obscured by shadows as the sun dipped lower in the sky. Then I heard it clearly, a crunching sound close behind me, like someone stepping on dry leaves. I froze, my body rigid, listening intently. The sound stopped when I stopped. My pulse was pounding in my ears. I convinced myself again that it was an animal, maybe a hiker who had taken a different trail. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it made. This trail was not popular. It was remote and difficult. What hiker would be on it at this hour, and why would they be keeping pace with me? I increased my pace, careful not to rush too much on the rocky path. I kept glancing behind me, straining to see any movement. The canyon walls were thick with undergrowth, and the shadows were deepening. I tried to remind myself of basic safety. Keep moving, stay calm, and avoid panicking. But my mind was racing. The forest, once beautiful and serene, now felt claustrophobic and hostile. Every snapped twig and rustling leaf made me jump. As I descended further, the trail became even narrower. The rocks were slick from previous rains, and small patches of loose gravel slid under my weight. I clutched at tree roots and jagged stones to maintain balance. Then, suddenly, a rock beneath my boot shifted violently. I stumbled and barely managed to catch myself with my hands against the canyon wall. My backpack threw me off balance, and I slid a few feet before stopping, my palms scraped and bleeding. My heart was hammering, and a cold sweat ran down my back. I knew I had to find a safer place to stop and rest, but the trail offered no such opportunity. The canyon was steep, and the narrow ledge left little room to maneuver. I inched forward cautiously, every sense alert. The sound behind me had stopped again, replaced by silence that felt heavier, almost expectant. I told myself it was fine, that nothing could happen as long as I stayed focused. Then I heard it again, louder this time, a deliberate snap, unmistakably human. Not an animal, not the wind. Someone was moving behind me, and they were careful, tracking me step by step. Panic surged through me, but I forced myself to remain calm. I considered my options. I could turn around, but the trail was too dangerous to move backward quickly. I could try to sprint, but on this terrain, that would likely lead to injury or worse. My mind raced, thinking through scenarios, calculating risks. I decided to keep moving forward, staying as quiet as possible while maintaining balance. The trail twisted and narrowed, eventually leading to a small rock overhang that jutted out from the canyon wall. I scrambled onto it and crouched, trying to make myself as small and inconspicuous as possible. From this position, I could see a portion of the trail below, and I scanned for any sign of movement. Minutes passed like hours. Every sound seemed amplified. The distant call of a bird, the rustle of leaves, even my own breathing. Then I saw it. A figure, partially obscured by shadows, moving deliberately along the trail below. They were dressed in dark clothing, blending into the forest, and their pace was steady, almost methodical. My stomach churned. I had no idea who they were or what they wanted, but I knew I had to stay hidden and find a way out. I waited, crouched on the overhang, watching the figure move away along the trail. Once I was sure they had passed, I took a calculated risk and resumed moving. My focus was absolute. I followed the trail as carefully as possible, my body tense, my senses on high alert. The canyon eventually opened into a dense forest, the path less treacherous but still isolated. I considered my options. I could try to backtrack to the trailhead, or I could push forward and hope to reach a more traveled section of the trail. I chose to move forward. The decision was driven by the hope that a wider trail or campsite would appear, offering safety and a place to rest. The forest thickened, and the light grew dim as evening approached. I checked my GPS device, trying to identify my position and any nearby markers. The signal was weak, but I could make out a trail junction a few miles ahead. I set my sights on that, determined to reach it before darkness fully descended. Hours passed. The forest seemed to change around me. The undergrowth denser, the air cooler and damper, the sounds of wildlife more pronounced. Every rustle made me flinch, every shadow seemed to shift. I kept moving, step by step, careful not to trip or slip. My legs ached, my feet were sore, and my water supply was running low. But I forced myself onward. Just as darkness fell completely, I finally reached the trail junction. Relief washed over me. This section was wider and easier to navigate, with clear markings and a faint path leading down toward a small ranger station I had read about on the map. I followed it cautiously, knowing that my ordeal was not entirely over. The forest was still isolated, and help was not immediate, but I felt a sense of progress. By the time I reached the ranger station, it was nearly midnight. I was exhausted, my body covered in cuts and bruises, my pack heavy, and my mind still tense from hours of fear. The station was empty, but the lights inside were on. I knocked on the door until a ranger finally appeared. After explaining my situation, they radioed for assistance, and I was guided safely down to the main trailhead. The experience left me shaken. I realized how quickly an ordinary hike could turn dangerous, how small missteps or unlucky encounters could escalate into life-threatening situations. I learned the importance of preparation, situational awareness, and the ability to remain calm under extreme stress. The forest, which had once been a place of peace and adventure,